You're not aggressive enough for this industry. My name is Vincent, 52 years old, and I spent 11 years building the procurement department at Morrison Manufacturing in Portland, Oregon. When Patricia Walsh walked into my office that Tuesday morning with a folder full of supplier quotes for substandard steel components, I knew something had shifted in ways I didn't like. These materials don't meet our safety specifications, I told her, sliding the documents back across my desk. Tensile strength is 30% below what our engineers require. Patricia adjusted her glasses and gave me that look she'd been perfecting since becoming our new CEO 3 months earlier. Vincent, we need to think differently about procurement. Our margins are suffering because you're too focused on over-engineering everything. I'd been hearing variations of this conversation for weeks, ever since Patricia took over from old Mr. Harrison, who'd built Morrison into a respected manufacturer of construction equipment. The pressure to cut costs had become relentless, but cutting costs on materials that kept workers safe wasn't something I could do. These components go into our crane assemblies, I said. If they fail, people. She leaned back in her chair, studying me like I was a problem to solve. Madison will be joining us next week. She has some fresh perspectives on supply chain optimization. Madison, Patricia's friend's daughter, straight out of business school with an MBA and zero real-world experience. Heard about her through the office gossip network. Young, ambitious, and apparently very eager to prove herself by implementing the kind of aggressive, cost-cutting strategies they taught in her program. I've been doing this job for over a decade, I said carefully. I know our suppliers, our quality standards, and what our customers expect. Exactly the problem. Patricia stood up, smoothing her skirt. You know the old way of doing things. This industry is changing, Vincent. Companies that don't adapt get left behind. She left my office without another word, but the message was clear. I sat there for a long time after she was gone, looking at the supplier quotes still scattered across my desk. Every instinct I developed over 11 years told me we were headed for trouble. The materials Patricia wanted to approve were cheap, but they were cheap for a reason. That evening I called my wife Rebecca from my truck in the parking lot. Something's coming, I told her. Can feel it. What I couldn't feel yet was how much worse it would get before it got better. Started at Morrison, right out of the military, where I'd learned that cutting corners on equipment specifications wasn't just bad business. It was deadly. Mr. Harrison hired me because he valued that mindset. I want someone who understands that our reputation depends on building things that last, he told me during my interview. Over the years, I'd built relationships with suppliers who shared that philosophy. Companies like Steelcraft Industries and Precision Components, family-owned businesses that took pride in their work. We paid fair prices for quality materials, and in return they gave us components that exceeded specifications. Our cranes and excavators were known throughout the Pacific Northwest for their reliability. My daughter Jessica had just started her sophomore year at Oregon State studying engineering. She'd grown up hearing me talk about the importance of safety standards and quality control. Dad always says that corners you cut today will cut you tomorrow, she'd joke when her friends complained about her attention to detail. But Patricia Walsh came from a different world. She'd worked for venture capital firms and consulting companies, places where success was measured in quarterly earnings reports rather than decades of accident-free operations. When the board brought her in to modernize Morrison, After Harrison's retirement, I'd hoped she'd understand what made our company special. Instead, she seemed determined to prove that everything we'd been doing was wrong. The warning signs had been subtle at first. Emails about procurement deficiency opportunities, requests for detailed cost breakdowns on every supplier contract, questions about whether we really needed to inspect every shipment when our suppliers had proven track records. Then Madison showed up, 26 years old, eager and armed with spreadsheets that showed how much money we could save by switching to cheaper suppliers. She attended every procurement meeting, taking notes and asking pointed questions about our legacy vendor relationships. Mr. Vincent, she said during one particularly tense meeting, have you considered that your emotional attachment to these suppliers might be affecting your judgment? Emotional attachment. That's what she called 11 years of building trust with companies that had never delivered a defective component. I started keeping copies of all my correspondence with Patricia and Madison. Something told me I might need documentation of my objections to their proposed changes. When they asked for my supplier contact lists and contract details, I complied, but I also made sure everything was properly documented. Rebecca noticed I was staying late more often, double-checking orders and reviewing quality reports. You're worried about something, she said. One evening, they're going to fire me, I told her. They just haven't figured out how yet. The end came on a Friday morning in November. Patricia called me into her office with Madison sitting beside her, both of them wearing expressions I'd seen before, the look of people who'd already made a decision and were just going through the motions of justification. Vincent, we've decided to restructure the procurement department, Patricia began. Madison will be taking over your responsibilities effective immediately. I sat there for a moment processing what I just heard. 11 years of service. And they were handing my job to someone who'd been with the company for exactly 3 weeks. May I ask why? Said Madison. Leaned forward, consulting her tablet. Your procurement practices are 37% more expensive than industry benchmarks. We've identified significant cost savings opportunities that you've been resistant to implementing. Those cost savings come from using materials that don't meet our safety specifications. Patricia waved her hand dismissively. Vincent, you're stuck in an outdated mindset. Modern manufacturing requires aggressive cost management. You're simply not aggressive enough for this industry. I thought about the crane that had collapsed in Seattle 2 years earlier because someone used substandard bolts to save $40 per unit. 3 workers died, but Patricia and Madison weren't thinking about Seattle. They were thinking about their next quarterly report. I understand, I said quietly. They seemed surprised by my calm response. Madison had probably expected me to argue or make a scene. Instead, I stood up and extended my hand to Patricia. Thank you for the lesson, said. She shook my hand, looking confused. The lesson? You've taught me something important about the difference between cost and value. Cleaned out my office that afternoon while the rest of the department watched in stunned silence. Jerry from shipping helped me carry my boxes to the truck. This is wrong, Mr. Vincent, he said. Everyone knows it sometimes. Comes wrong is just the first step toward something right. Told him. That weekend I sat in my garage going through 11 years of supplier contacts, quality reports, and industry relationships. I had something Patricia and Madison didn't understand. Not just knowledge but trust. Kind of trust that comes from always doing the right thing even when it costs more. Called Tom Bradley at Steelcraft Industries on Monday morning. Vincent, I heard what happened at Morrison. He said Patricia Walsh called here last week demanding we cut our prices by 20% or lose the contract. What did you tell her? Told her our prices reflect our quality. Morrison wants cheaper steel, they'll have to find someone else to provide it. That's when I knew exactly what I was going to do. Starting a company at 52 wasn't something I'd ever planned, but neither was watching Patricia Walsh destroy everything Mr. Harrison had built. I spent the first month after my termination researching business licenses, consulting with lawyers, and reaching out to the suppliers who'd been dropped by Morrison's new aggressive procurement strategy. The response surprised me. Tom Bradley at Steelcraft wasn't just interested in working with my new company, he wanted to invest in it. You understand quality, Vincent, he said over coffee at a diner in Southeast Portland. There's a market for companies that still believe in doing things right. Within 6 weeks, sighed Incorporated Advanced Materials Corporation and secured initial funding from 3 suppliers who'd grown tired of competing in the race to the bottom. Our business model was simple: develop and source superior materials for manufacturers who valued safety and reliability over short-term cost savings. Meanwhile, Morrison's new procurement strategy was beginning to show results, just not the ones Patricia had expected. Jessica called me from college in early February. Dad, did you see the news about Morrison? I hadn't, but a quick internet search revealed the headline: Morrison manufacturing issues, voluntary recall of Model J series excavators. The article mentioned potential component failures and an abundance of caution regarding operator safety. I knew exactly which components had failed. The hydraulic fittings Madison had sourced from a discount supplier in Tennessee. The same ones I'd rejected for failing to meet pressure specifications. The recall would cost Morrison approximately $2 million, not counting the damage to their reputation. Patricia called me the next day. Vincent, I know we had our differences, but I was wondering if you might consider consulting for us on this recall situation. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'm afraid I'm not available for consulting, Patricia. I'm too busy building my own company. Own company. Her voice carried a mixture of surprise and skepticism. Vincent, starting a manufacturing business requires significant capital and industry relationships. Are you sure you're prepared for that kind of challenge? I appreciate your concern, I said, but I think I'll manage. What Patricia didn't know was that Advanced Materials had already secured contracts with 3 of Morrison's former customers, companies that had grown concerned about Morrison's quality issues and were looking for alternatives. Word travels fast in the construction equipment industry, especially when it involved safety problems. By spring, we'd moved out of my garage and into a small facility in Gresham. I hired Jerry from Morrison's shipping department as our first employee, followed by 2 quality control specialists who'd been laid off when Patricia eliminated Morrison's inspection team to cut costs. The real breakthrough came when we developed a new steel alloy that exceeded industry strength requirements while remaining cost competitive with standard materials. Our metallurgist, Dr. Sarah Chen, a brilliant woman I'd met through Tom Bradley, had been working on the formula for years at her previous job. When her former employer showed no interest in pursuing the innovation, she brought it to Advanced Materials. This Alloy could revolutionize construction. Equipment manufacturing, she explained, during her presentation to our board. It's 30% stronger than current industry standards, but the production cost is only 15% higher. Within months we had equipment manufacturers calling us, instead of the other way around. Companies like Cascade Construction and Northwest Heavy Industries were eager to differentiate their products with superior materials. Our waiting list grew longer each week. Meanwhile, Morrison continued to struggle. Her second recall came in June. Defective bearing assemblies that Madison had sourced from an overseas supplier with questionable quality control. Third recall followed in August. I didn't take pleasure in Morrison's problems, but I couldn't help feeling vindicated. Every recall, every customer complaint, every safety investigation proved that the outdated mindset Patricia had criticized was actually the foundation of sustainable business practice. By October, Advanced Materials had grown to 32 employees and occupied 3 buildings in our expanded facility. We developed relationships with manufacturers across the Western United States, all of them drawn by our reputation for uncompromising quality. That's when I learned Morrison was in serious financial trouble. Call came from an unexpected source. Mr. Harrison himself, the founder Patricia had effectively pushed into retirement. He'd heard about Advanced Materials through industry contacts and wanted to meet for lunch. Vincent, I owe you an apology, he said as we sat in the same restaurant where he'd offered me my first promotion 10 years earlier. I should have fought harder when the board brought in Patricia. I knew she didn't understand her business. You were ready to retire, Mr. Harrison. You deserve to enjoy it without fighting corporate politics. He shook his head. Fought corporate politics for 30 years. Building that company. I should have fought a little longer to protect it. He paused, studying his coffee. Patricia's been calling me. Morrison's in trouble. Real trouble. The details he shared were worse than I'd imagined. The recalls had triggered multiple lawsuits from customers whose equipment had failed. Insurance companies were refusing to renew Morrison's liability coverage. 3 major contracts had been cancelled due to safety concerns. But there's something else, Mr. Harrison continued. Something Patricia doesn't know yet. The financial audit I requested before selling my shares is about to become public. It shows that Madison's procurement decisions have created liability exposure of approximately $50 million. $50 million more than Morrison's annual revenue. The board is planning to file for bankruptcy protection, he said quietly. They're hoping to restructure their debts and start over with new management. I sat back, absorbing the magnitude of Morrison's collapse. About the employees. That's why I'm talking to you, Vincent. There's going to be an asset sale. Facilities, the equipment, the customer contracts, everything will go to the highest bidder. He met my eyes across table. Advanced Materials could submit a bid. The idea had never occurred to me. When I'd started my company, I'd been focused on building something new, not acquiring something broken. But Mr. Harrison was right. Morrison's assets could accelerate Advanced Materials growth by decades. Ooh, you really think we're ready for that kind of expansion? I think you understand Morrison's true value better than anyone. He said you know which customers to keep, which suppliers to trust, which employees are worth retaining. Most importantly, you understand what made Morrison successful. Before Patricia tried to fix what wasn't broken. That evening I called an emergency board meeting with Tom Bradley and our Other investors. When I explained the situation, their response was unanimous. Advanced Materials should prepare a bid for Morrison's assets. It's poetic. Justice, Tom said. You get fired for refusing to compromise on quality, and now quality is going to save the company that fired you. Over the next few weeks, we worked with attorneys and financial advisors to structure our bid. The process revealed the full scope of Morrison's mismanagement. Patricia's aggressive cost-cutting had alienated their best suppliers. Their quality problems had driven away their most valuable customers. And Madison's inexperience had created legal liabilities that would take years to resolve. But underneath all that damage was the company Mr. Harrison had built. Solid customer relationships, valuable contracts, and skilled employees who'd been forced to implement policies they knew were wrong. We're not just buying assets, I told Rebecca one evening as we reviewed the bid documents. We're rescuing a company from people who never understood what made it valuable. Bankruptcy court scheduled the asset sale for late November. Advanced Materials would be competing against 3 other bidders, including a private equity firm that specialized in distressed manufacturing companies. Wasn't worried about the competition. Was the only bidder who knew Morrison's true worth. The bankruptcy auction was scheduled for November 28th at the federal courthouse in downtown Portland. Advanced Materials had submitted our bid 3 days earlier, $42 million for Morrison's complete asset package, including facilities, equipment, customer contracts, and intellectual property. Our bid wasn't the highest. Meridian Capital, the private equity firm, had offered $48 million, but our bid included something theirs didn't. Commitment to retain Morrison's existing workforce and honor all customer warranties. The court will consider more than just the dollar amount, our attorney explained. They want to see bids that preserve jobs and maintain business continuity. What the court didn't know, what no one except Mr. Harrison and I knew, was that Advanced Materials had already secured agreements with Morrison's 3 largest customers to continue their contracts under new management. We'd also arranged temporary employment agreements with 15 key Morrison employees, including Jerry and 2 of the quality control specialists I'd worked with for years. Patricia had no idea any of this was happening. According to Mr. Harrison, she'd been focused on finding a new job, confident that the bankruptcy would be handled by attorneys and accountants while she moved on to her next opportunity. She was about to discover how wrong she was. The auction took place in a small courtroom packed with lawyers, accountants, and representatives from the bidding companies. Patricia sat in the front row with Madison beside her, both looking uncomfortable in a process they clearly didn't understand. When the judge called for final presentations, Meridian Capital went first. Her representative, a sharp-dressed woman in her 30s, outlined their plans to strip Morrison's assets, sell the real estate, and liquidate the inventory. This approach maximizes recovery for creditors and eliminates ongoing operational risks, she explained. Stood up when our turn came, holding a folder containing letters from Morrison's employees, customers, and suppliers. Your Honor, Advanced Materials Corporation respectfully submits that Morrison Manufacturing represents more than just distressed assets. The company has 40 years of history serving the construction industry. Its employees have decades of experience. Customers depend on continuing service for equipment they've already purchased. I opened the folder and began reading. Northwest Construction writes, Morrison's excavators are the backbone of our fleet. We need assurance that parts and service will continue. Pacific Infrastructure states, we've worked with Morrison for 15 years. Equipment reliability is crucial to our operations. Patricia turned in her seat finally, recognizing my voice. Her face went pale as she realized who was presenting the competing bid. Cascade Engineering writes, Morrison's quality standards have always exceeded our expectations. We hope new ownership will maintain those standards. I looked directly at Patricia as I read the next letter. Steelcraft Industries states, Morrison was our largest customer until recent management changes compromised their quality requirements. We would welcome the opportunity to resume our partnership under new leadership. The judge asked several questions about our financing and operational plans. Answered each one with specific details about how Advanced Materials would integrate Morrison's operations while maintaining our quality standards. When the presentations ended, the judge announced a 30-minute recess to review the bid. Patricia cornered me in the hallway, her composure finally cracking. This is ridiculous, Vincent. You were just a procurement manager who couldn't adapt to modern business practices. Was a procurement manager who understood the difference between cost and value, I replied calmly. The court documents show exactly what your modern business practices accomplished. Madison stood behind Patricia looking confused and frightened. Court documents. The liability assessment from the Pickles said $50 million in potential damages, all traceable to procurement decisions made after I was terminated. Patricia's confident facade collapsed entirely as the implications sank in. The judge returned to the courtroom at exactly 3:00 p.m., his expression revealing nothing as he reviewed the final bid documents. Patricia sat rigidly in the front row, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrests of her. Madison slouched beside her, staring at her hands. After careful consideration of all factors including bid amounts, operational continuity, employee retention and creditor recovery, this court awards the Morrison Manufacturing Asset Package to Advanced Materials Corporation. The gavel fell with a sound that seemed to echo through the silent courtroom. Patricia's sharp intake of breath was audible from 3 rows away. I stood to acknowledge the court's decision, keeping my expression neutral despite the satisfaction coursing through me. Our attorney shook my hand, but my attention was focused on Patricia's reaction. She turned in her seat, her face a mixture of shock and rage. Is impossible, she whispered loud enough for me to hear. You can't just. How did you, Mr. Vincent? The judge continued. The court appreciates Advanced Materials' commitment to workforce retention and operational continuity. These factors were instrumental in our decision. Patricia stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Your Honor, I object to this decision. There are procedural issues. Mrs. Walsh, the judge interrupted, are not a party to these proceedings. The court's decision is final. Madison tugged at Patricia's sleeve, trying to get her to sit down, but Patricia shook her off. She stared at me with undisguised fury, finally understanding that the man she dismissed as not aggressive enough had just purchased the company she'd destroyed. Congratulations, Mr. Vincent, the judge said. Advanced Materials Corporation is now the owner of all Morrison manufacturing assets. Transfer documents will be processed within 48 hours. As the courtroom began to empty, Patricia remained frozen in place, still, staring at me in disbelief. The woman, who'd lectured me about adapting to modern business practices, had just watched her former subordinate acquire her company through the bankruptcy sheet. I walked past Patricia without a word, but stopped when she called my name. Vincent, wait. Her voice had lost all its corporate authority, replaced by something closer to desperation. This doesn't make sense. You were just a procurement manager. How did you finance this? I built relationships with people who value quality over quick profits, I said simply. The same suppliers you alienated invested in advanced materials because they knew we understood what you never did. Madison finally found her voice. Mr. Vincent, what happens to us now? I looked at her for a moment, remembering the eager young woman who dismissed my emotional attachment to reliable suppliers. You'll figure it out, Madison. We're aggressive enough for this industry. Remember, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters who'd gotten wind of the unusual bankruptcy auction. Several called out questions about advanced materials plans for Morrison, but I declined to comment beyond confirming that all Morrison employees would be invited to continue their employment under new management. Tom Bradley was waiting by my truck, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. How does it feel to own your old company, boss? I don't own Morrison Manufacturing anymore, I told him. Morrison Manufacturing died the day Patricia Walsh decided that corners were worth cutting. What I bought today were the assets to build something better. 3 weeks later, I stood in the renovated facility that now displayed the Advanced Materials logo where Morrison's sign had hung for 40 years. Jerry was training 2 new quality control inspectors, both of them eager to learn from someone who'd never compromised on safety standards. The first excavator rolling off our production line bore a small plaque that read, "Built to last by people who care." Patricia Walsh and Madison faced complete professional ruin when the full scope of their mismanagement became public record through the bankruptcy proceedings. Patricia's career ended permanently when multiple regulatory agencies cited her decisions as direct contributing factors and safety violations that resulted in equipment failures, making her legally unemployable in any manufacturing role requiring safety oversight. The lawsuits from the recalls followed her personally, as corporate attorneys successfully argued that her aggressive cost-cutting directives constituted gross negligence that voided her executive protection clauses. Madison's MBA became worthless when her procurement disasters were studied in business schools nationwide as textbook examples of how inexperience and poor judgment could destroy established companies, while her association with the Morrison collapse made her unemployable in procurement or supply chain management. The $50 million in liability exposure they created haunted them both through years of depositions, court appearances, and personal asset seizures as creditors pursued every avenue of recovery. I smiled as I walked through the facility where men and women took pride in building equipment that would never fail the people who depended on it, understanding that sometimes patience and principle matter more than aggression and ambition.